Derek Langston just wanted to get home. He'd spent the last 6 days in a cramped rental car outside a warehouse on the edge of Atlanta, watching, waiting, taking notes. No sleep, bad coffee, and the kind of silence that gets inside your bones. Now all he craved was his own bed, a hot shower, and maybe 20 minutes with his eyes closed before the next case landed on his desk. He boarded the flight in his usual plain clothes, dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and a worn leather jacket that had seen better years. No flashy logos, no obvious gear, just a tired man heading home after a long week. He kept his head down, nodded politely at the gate agent, and found his window seat in row 14. The woman already seated in 14A didn't look at him at first. But the moment he sat down, he felt it. The subtle shift in her posture, the way her hand tightened around the strap of her purse like it might leap off her shoulder and run away. She inched her knees toward the aisle, putting as much space between them as the narrow seat allowed. Derek didn't react. He'd been here before, too many times to count. He pulled out a paperback novel, something light, a mystery with a dog on the cover, and opened it to the page he'd dog-eared the night before. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Outside, the Georgia sun glinted off the tarmac. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. Then it started. First a sigh, then a muttered comment to no one in particular. Unbelievable. Derek kept reading. A few minutes later, the woman leaned forward and flagged down a flight attendant, a young man with kind eyes and a name tag that read, Trevor. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but sharp. "I don't feel safe." Trevor crouched slightly to hear her better. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" She glanced at Derek, then back at Trevor, lowering her voice even more. "I'm sitting next to him, and he's been acting strange, staring, muttering. I don't know what he's capable of." Derek didn't look up. He turned a page slowly, deliberately. His heart beat steady, but his jaw tightened just a fraction. Trevor's expression shifted, concern, then caution. He gave Derek a quick, neutral glance before returning his attention to the woman. "Sir hasn't done anything unusual since boarding, ma'am. He's been reading the whole time." "That's what I'm saying," she hissed. "It's too quiet." "People like that, they're always quiet right before they snap." Trevor blinked. "People like that?" She caught herself, flustered. "You know what I mean." A few rows ahead, a man turned around. 2 teenagers in the back exchanged glances. The cabin, once calm, now hummed with a different kind of tension, one laced with discomfort and unspoken judgment. Trevor stood up straighter. "Ma'am, unless there's a direct threat or disruptive behavior, we can't move passengers mid-flight. Seating is fixed once we're airborne, but I'm telling you, I feel unsafe." Her voice rose, drawing more attention. "Why isn't anyone listening to me? Is it because I'm a woman? Or because of... You know?" She trailed off, but her eyes flicked toward Derek again. This time, Derek looked up, not with anger, not with fear, just a quiet, steady gaze that held hers for a beat too long. She looked away first. Trevor took a breath. "I understand your concern, but I've observed this passenger since boarding. He's done nothing wrong. In fact, he's been one of the most respectful travelers we've had today." She crossed her arms. "Fine, but if something happens, it's on you." The plane lifted off the ground, Atlanta shrinking below. Clouds drifted past the window. Derek closed his book gently and rested it in his lap. He didn't open it again. For the next hour, the woman fidgeted. She checked her phone, pretended to sleep, then shot nervous glances at Derek every few minutes. Once, she whispered something to the passenger across the aisle, a man in a baseball cap who just shook his head and turned away. Derek stayed still, calm. He thought about his niece's birthday next week, about the jazz playlist waiting on his phone, about how he used to love flying before every trip became a test of patience and prejudice. Then, halfway through the flight, she did it again, this time, louder. "I need to speak to the captain," she announced, standing up abruptly. "This man is making me extremely uncomfortable." "I want him removed." Trevor rushed over. "Please sit down, ma'am. We're at cruising altitude. We can't—" "I don't care," she snapped. "He's dangerous. Look at him." He hasn't said a word. "That's how they operate." A hush fell over the nearby rows. Some passengers looked down. Others stared openly. One woman pulled her child closer. Derek finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, but carried clearly through the cabin. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been sitting here reading a book about a detective and his golden retriever. I haven't looked at you once since I sat down. I haven't spoken to anyone. I just want to get home," she sputtered. You can't prove that." "I don't have to," he said softly. "But maybe ask yourself why you assumed the worst the second you saw me." She sat down hard, face flushed. Trevor leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, are you okay?" Derek gave a small nod. "Just tired." Up in the cockpit, the captain had been monitoring the situation through the intercom. After a brief radio call with ground operations, his voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to a reported passenger disturbance, federal authorities will meet us upon arrival in Chicago. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your patience." A murmur spread through the cabin. The woman in 14A went pale. Derek didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked out the window at the endless sky, his reflection faint in the glass. Tired eyes, quiet strength. A man who'd faced worse and still showed up. As the plane began its slow descent toward O'Hare, the woman turned to him one last time. I didn't mean—" Derek cut her off gently. "Save it." Then, almost to himself, he added, "You might want to rethink what you say next." Outside, the city lights of Chicago began to twinkle below. Blue and red flashed in the distance, waiting on the tarmac. And for the first time all flight, Derek allowed himself a small, weary sigh. It wasn't going to be a quiet trip home after all. The cabin stayed quiet after the captain's announcement, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes right before a storm, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. The woman in 14A kept glancing at Derek, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. She tried to look composed, but her eyes darted toward the window every time a flight attendant walked by. She'd gone from angry to nervous, and now she was sliding fast into panic. A few rows back, a young guy with headphones around his neck leaned forward. "Hey," he said, voice low but clear. He's been sitting there reading the whole time. "I've had my eye on my screen, but even I noticed he hasn't moved, hasn't talked, hasn't done anything weird." The woman snapped her head toward him. "You don't understand how these people operate," she said, voice sharp. "They act normal until they're not." The young man blinked like he'd been slapped. He looked around as if searching for backup. A woman across the aisle shook her head slightly. Another passenger muttered, "That's not okay." Derek didn't react outwardly, but inside it stung. Not because it was new. He'd heard variations of that line since he was a kid, but because it was so casually cruel. Like his very presence was a threat just because of his skin. He thought back to his first week at the academy years ago. His instructor, a grizzled veteran with a limp and a dry sense of humor, had pulled him aside after a training exercise. "You're going to be twice as good just to be seen as half as trustworthy," he'd said. Not fair, but true. So be better, and be ready. Derek had taken that to heart, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. He joined the Bureau not for the badge or the authority, but because he believed in fairness and because he knew someone like him in that role could change things, even in small ways. Now at 38, he was tired of proving he belonged. But here he was again. Up front, the flight attendants huddled near the galley. Trevor was talking fast into the intercom, relaying details to the cockpit. Another attendant, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a no-nonsense walk, kept glancing back at row 14. She'd been on this route for 15 years. She'd seen it all. Drunk passengers, medical emergencies, even a mid-air proposal gone wrong. But this felt different. Ugly in a way that lingered. She walked back slowly and knelt beside Derek's seat, keeping her voice low. "You holding up okay?" He gave her a small nod. "Yeah, just frustrating." She hesitated, then said, "We've got your back. Whatever happens on the ground, you didn't do anything wrong." "Thanks," he said, and meant it. Meanwhile, the woman was trying to rally support. She turned to the man in 13A, an older gentleman with a newspaper. "Don't you think it's strange? A big guy like that so quiet? Doesn't that seem off to you?" The man lowered his paper slowly. "Lady," he said, voice calm but firm. "I served with men who looked like him in Korea. Saved my life more than once. So no, it doesn't seem off. It seems like you've got a problem I can't fix." She recoiled like she'd been burned. The tension in the cabin shifted. It wasn't just about her anymore. People were choosing sides, not with words, but with silence, with turned backs, with protective glances toward Derek. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken but powerful. Derek watched it all without moving. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He never was. But he also wasn't going to shrink himself to make someone else comfortable with their prejudice. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, the captain came on again. "We'll be landing in about 15 minutes. Please remain seated. Law enforcement will be at the gate to assist with the reported incident." The woman's hand started shaking. She pulled out her phone, typed something fast, then put it away. Her breathing got shallow. Derek finally turned to her. Not with anger. Not with mockery. Just with a quiet intensity that made her freeze. "Ma'am," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You spent the last hour accusing me of being dangerous, just because I'm a black man sitting next to you. You told people I was muttering threats when I hadn't said a word. You made a scene that forced this crew to involve federal agents. And for what? Because I didn't look the way you expected?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "You might want to rethink what you say next," he added. "Because the people waiting down there, they're not going to care about your feelings. They're going to care about facts. And the fact is, you created a disturbance based on nothing but fear, and that fear had a color." Her eyes filled with tears, but not the kind that come from regret, more like panic. Like she was realizing, too late, that the story she'd told herself didn't hold up in the real world. The plane dipped lower. The city lights spread out below like scattered stars. Derek leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't scared. He'd dealt with worse in dark alleys and interrogation rooms in neighborhoods where his badge was both shield and target. But this hurt in a different way, because it wasn't about crime or danger. It was about being seen as less than human just for existing. A child 2 rows ahead pointed out the window. "Look, Mommy, we're landing." The mother smiled softly and squeezed her daughter's hand. Normal life continuing just a few feet away. Derek closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his sister's voice on the phone last night. "You carry too much, Dee, you always have." He thought about his old neighbor, Mr. Ellis, who used to say, "Stand tall, son," even when they try to make you small. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud. The plane slowed, turning toward the terminal. Outside, 2 police cars and a black SUV with government plates waited near the jet bridge. Passengers began gathering their things, but no one stood up yet. Everyone was waiting. The woman in 14A fumbled with her seatbelt, her movements jerky. She kept glancing at Derek like he might vanish or pounce. He didn't move. He just sat there, calm, present, unshaken. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, the flight attendants made an announcement. All passengers except those involved in the incident may deplane normally. Please allow others to exit first. One by one, people stood, grabbed their bags, and filed out. Some gave Derek a nod. Others offered a quiet thank you or a sympathetic look. The young man from the back even gave him a thumbs up. Soon, only a handful of people remained. Derek, the woman, the flight crew, and a few passengers who'd been asked to stay as witnesses. Trevor approached Derek again. "They're going to want to talk to you first," he said quietly. "Just tell them what happened. You've got nothing to worry about." Derek stood slowly, stretching his shoulders. "I know." He walked toward the front of the plane, not with swagger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced fire and walked through it. Behind him, the woman sat frozen in her seat, staring at her hands like they might hold an answer. Outside, the cold Chicago wind whipped across the tarmac. Blue and red lights pulsed softly against the glass. Derek took a deep breath. He wasn't just going home anymore. He was walking into something bigger. Something that might not change the world, but could at least change one person's mind, or stop someone else from going through what he just did. And that was worth the extra hour. The jet bridge connected with a soft thump, and the cabin door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Cold Chicago wind slipped in like an unwelcome guest. Outside, 2 local police officers stood beside a man in a dark suit. Federal, no question, with a radio clipped to his belt and eyes that scanned the plane like he'd done this 100 times. Derek stepped off first. He didn't rush, didn't look back. Just walked down the narrow corridor with his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders relaxed but posture straight. The kind of walk that said, "I belong here," without needing to say a word. The federal agent met him halfway. "Special Agent Langston?" he asked, voice low. Derek nodded. "That's me." The agent gave a slight nod of respect. "I'm Agent Ruiz, Air Marshal Division. We got the call from the captain. Said there was a disturbance involving false accusations and possible bias-based harassment." "Yeah," Derek said. "That about covers it." Behind them, the woman from 14A finally emerged, flanked by Trevor and another flight attendant. She looked smaller now, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like she wanted to disappear into her coat. When she saw the officers, her breath hitched. Ruiz turned to her. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for a brief statement." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Nodded weakly. They moved to a quiet corner near Gate B12, away from the flow of deplaning passengers. A few curious onlookers slowed down, but airport security gently ushered them along. This wasn't a show. It was procedure. Ruiz pulled out a small notepad. "Agent Langston, can you walk me through what happened?" Derek kept it simple. "I boarded the flight in Atlanta, sat down, read a book, didn't speak to anyone. About an hour in, the passenger next to me started complaining to the crew that I made her uncomfortable. She claimed I was staring, muttering, acting suspicious. None of it was true. I hadn't even looked at her until she started causing a scene." He paused. "Then she demanded I be removed. Said people like me are quiet before they snap. When the captain announced law enforcement would meet us, she panicked. That's when I finally spoke up." Ruiz's pen moved steadily. "Did you identify yourself at any point during the flight?" "Not until right before landing," Derek said. "I showed her my credentials, just enough for her to see the badge and ID. Didn't make a spectacle. Just wanted her to understand she was accusing a federal officer of being a threat." "Based on nothing but his skin," Ruiz glanced up. "And her reaction?" "Shock. Fear. Regret, maybe. But mostly fear of consequences." The woman, standing a few feet away with a police officer, overheard. She blurted out, "I didn't know he was FBI. I felt unsafe." Ruiz turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, feeling unsafe doesn't give you the right to falsely accuse someone of being dangerous, especially when your fear is rooted in race. That's not just a misunderstanding. It's a safety risk on a commercial flight." She flinched. "I didn't mean it like that." "But you said it like that," Derek said quietly. "And words like that don't just hurt. They put people in danger. What if someone had believed you? What if a passenger had tried to handle me themselves? You don't get to cry safety while creating the very threat you claim to fear." She looked down, tears welling. "I'm sorry." Derek didn't respond right away. He wasn't looking for an apology. He'd heard plenty of those, empty, rushed, meant to ease the speaker's guilt, not heal the wound. Instead, he turned to Ruiz. "I'm not pressing charges right now, but I do want this documented. Officially. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who gets treated like a suspect, just for existing in the wrong seat, the wrong neighborhood, the wrong skin." Ruiz nodded. "We'll file a full incident report. The airline will get a copy. So will the Department of Transportation. And honestly, this kind of thing is exactly why we've been pushing for better crew training on bias-related disturbances." One of the local officers stepped forward. "We can still cite her for causing a public disturbance if you'd like." Derek shook his head. "No, but she should know this has consequences. Not jail, understanding. Maybe education, maybe reflection. Because if she walks away thinking, 'Oh, I got lucky,' nothing changes." The woman looked up, stunned. You don't want me punished?" "I want you to learn," he said. "Punishment doesn't fix ignorance, but maybe this moment will stick with you longer than a fine ever could." A silence settled over the group. Even the airport noise, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, the hum of overhead lights, seemed to soften. Ruiz closed his notepad. "All right, we'll wrap this up formally in the next 24 hours. Agent Langston, you're free to go. Thank you for your composure up there." "That took serious restraint." Derek gave a small smile. "Part of the job." He turned to leave but paused. Looked back at the woman one last time. "Next time you feel unsafe around someone who looks different, ask yourself why, and maybe, just maybe, give them the same benefit of the doubt you'd want for yourself." Then he walked away. Not fast. Not angry, just done. He found a quiet bench near a coffee kiosk and sat down, finally letting his shoulders drop. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep weariness. He pulled out his phone. One missed call from his sister. A text from his partner. "Heard your flight got interesting, you okay?" He typed back, "Alive, tired, but okay." As he waited for his ride, he watched people pass by. Families reuniting, business travelers rushing, couples holding hands. Normal life moving forward. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, dropped her stuffed bunny near his feet. He picked it up and handed it back with a smile. "You almost lost your co-pilot," she grinned. "Thanks, mister." Her mom gave him a warm nod. No fear, no suspicion. Just human kindness. In that moment, Derek remembered why he did this work. Not for the badge, not for the authority, but for the quiet moments of connection, the ones that reminded him people could be decent if given the chance. His phone buzzed again. This time, an email notification. Subject line, "Urgent, request for debrief, behavioral analysis unit." He opened it. They'd seen the preliminary report, wanted to talk to him about turning this incident into a training module for airline staff and federal personnel, how to recognize and de-escalate bias-driven confrontations without escalating tension. He sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of frustration. It was the kind that comes when you realize your pain might help someone else avoid the same. He typed a quick reply. "Available tomorrow. Let's talk." Then he stood, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed toward the exit. Outside, the Chicago evening was cold and gray, but the streetlights cast long, steady beams on the wet pavement. He didn't look back, because the real work wasn't in the confrontation. It was in what came after. And for the first time in hours, Derek felt like he was heading somewhere that mattered, not just home but forward. The next morning, Derek sat in a quiet corner booth at a diner 2 blocks from his apartment. Steam rose from a black coffee and the smell of toasted rye and bacon hung in the air. Outside, Chicago drizzle turned the sidewalks into mirrors. He hadn't slept much. Not because of the flight, though that was part of it, but because his mind kept circling back to the woman's face when he showed her the badge. The shock. The shame. The way her certainty had crumbled in seconds. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the swirls fade. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from his sister. "You talked to anyone yet? Or are you going to bottle it up like always?" He smiled faintly. She knew him too well. Before he could reply, another notification popped up. An email from the airline's customer relations team. They'd opened an internal investigation. They wanted to speak with him about crew response, passenger safety protocols, and whether their staff handled the situation appropriately. They also mentioned they'd reached out to the woman, who'd agreed to participate in a restorative dialogue program if Derek was open to it. He wasn't sure he was. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because forgiveness felt too heavy when he hadn't even had time to process what happened. He took a sip of coffee, bitter, strong, just how he liked it, and thought about the call he'd gotten late last night from the behavioral analysis unit. They didn't just want a report. They wanted him in the room to help design a training scenario based on real experience, not as a victim, but as someone who'd stayed calm under pressure, who'd chosen de-escalation over confrontation, who'd used his position not to shame but to teach. That part felt right. Later that afternoon, he met with 2 agents from the unit in a small conference room downtown. No uniforms, no formal setup. Just 3 people with notebooks and a shared goal. They asked him to walk through every detail. The tone of the woman's voice, the body language of the crew, the moment he decided to reveal his badge. They weren't looking for drama. They were looking for patterns, triggers, missed opportunities for intervention. "What do you wish had happened differently?" one of them asked. Derek leaned back in his chair. "I wish the crew had been trained to recognize when a safety concern is actually bias in disguise. Not every complaint is equal. Some come from fear. Others come from prejudice dressed up as fear. There's a difference," they nodded, took notes, asked thoughtful questions. No judgment, just listening. By the end of the meeting, they'd outlined a pilot program, a 20-minute module for airline staff that used anonymized real cases, like his, to teach how to respond when a passenger makes racially charged accusations. It would include scripts, body language cues, and clear escalation paths that protect both the accused and the flight's safety. Derek agreed to review the draft. Quietly, he felt something shift inside him, not relief exactly, but purpose. Like the ugliness of that flight could become something useful. Meanwhile, the woman, whose name he still didn't know, was dealing with her own fallout. She'd been contacted by the airline that morning. No fines, no legal action, but her frequent flyer account was suspended indefinitely. She'd also been required to complete an 8-hour online course on unconscious bias and civil rights in public spaces before she could fly with them again. And if she wanted to appeal the suspension, she'd need to submit a written reflection on her actions and attend a live session with a diversity facilitator. At first, she'd been furious, called it overreach. But then she watched the passenger's phone video, the one that had quietly spread online. In it, Derek sat perfectly still while she ranted. He didn't raise his voice, didn't glare, just waited, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger but with quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. She replayed that clip 3 times. The third time, she cried, not because she was caught, but because she saw herself clearly for the first time in years, how her fear had turned into cruelty, how her assumptions had put an innocent man at risk, how easily she'd let prejudice speak for her. She started the bias course that night. Back in Chicago, Derek returned to his apartment as dusk fell. He changed into sweatpants, heated up leftover soup, and sat on his couch with the TV on low. A documentary about jazz musicians played in the background, but he wasn't really watching. He was thinking about his niece's school project. She was writing about heroes in everyday life. He'd told her to interview a teacher or a firefighter.
She texted back, "What about Uncle D?"
He'd laughed it off. But now, sitting alone in the quiet, he wondered, was it possible to be a hero just by refusing to become what people expect you to be? His phone rang. It was his partner again. "You doing all right?" the voice asked. "Getting there," Derek said. "It's weird. I didn't do anything special. Just sat in a seat and stayed calm. But now people are acting like I climbed a mountain. Maybe because most people wouldn't have stayed calm," his partner said gently. "Most would have yelled back. Walked off the plane, lost it. You didn't. And that matters." Derek was quiet for a moment. "I just didn't want to give her the satisfaction of proving her wrong by becoming what she feared." "Exactly," his partner said. "That's the hard part. Choosing dignity when the world gives you every reason to drop it." They talked for a few more minutes about work, about weekend plans, about nothing important. But it was the kind of conversation that reminded Derek he wasn't alone. Later, as he brushed his teeth before bed, he caught his reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, a line between his brows that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But also something else: steadiness, resolve. He thought about the young man on the plane who'd spoken up, the older veteran who'd shut down the woman's nonsense, the flight attendants who'd stood by him without hesitation. The world wasn't all bad. It was just uneven, full of people trying, failing, learning, and sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing when it mattered. He turned off the light and climbed into bed. The city hummed outside his window, cars, distant sirens, the occasional laugh from the street below. For the first time since the flight, he felt peace, not because the problem was solved. Racism didn't vanish because one woman took a course or one airline updated its training, but because he'd shown up as himself and hadn't let fear or anger steer him. And maybe, just maybe, that small act of grace would ripple further than he knew. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he'd review the training module draft. Tomorrow, he'd keep showing up. But tonight he let himself rest. 3 months had passed since that flight from Atlanta, and life had settled into a new kind of rhythm for Derek. The headlines had faded. The viral clip had slowed to a trickle of shares. But something quieter, more lasting, had taken root. He stood in the back of a training room at a major airline's crew academy, arms loosely crossed, watching a group of new flight attendants navigate a simulated passenger conflict. On screen, an actor played a woman insisting the man beside her be moved. "He just gives me a bad feeling," she said, voice tight with manufactured fear. "You know how it is." The trainees exchanged glances. One stepped forward. "Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable, but unless there's a specific safety issue, like yelling, threats, or physical actions, I can't ask another passenger to move based on a feeling." That wouldn't be fair, and it could actually create a bigger problem. Derek didn't move, but inside he exhaled. That line, simple, firm, grounded in policy, not panic, was exactly what he'd hoped for. It wasn't about shaming the accuser. It was about protecting the accused while keeping the whole cabin safe. This training module, recognizing bias in passenger complaints, was now required for every new crew member. It had started as a rough idea after his flight, shaped by late-night calls with behavioral experts, airline safety leads, and even a few retired flight attendants who'd seen decades of these situations go sideways. Derek had insisted it not be about him. No names, no dramatic reenactments. Just real tools for real people facing real tension at 35,000 feet. After the simulation, the instructor turned to the group. This scenario comes from an actual event. A federal agent was accused of being suspicious simply for sitting quietly. Because the crew stayed calm and followed protocol, the situation didn't escalate into something dangerous, but it could have. A young man in the front row raised his hand. Did the person who made the false report ever understand what they'd done? The instructor nodded. She completed a bias awareness program, wrote a personal reflection, and later volunteered with a community group that helps people recognize unconscious prejudice. She didn't have to, but she chose to. Derek hadn't known that part. He'd heard she'd finished the course, but not that she'd gone further. He felt a quiet shift in his chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to respect. Growth was hard, and she'd done the work. Later that day, over coffee in the Academy's lounge, the airline's head of safety handed him a printed copy of their updated passenger policy. "We added a whole section on false accusations rooted in discrimination," she said. "Clear language, clear consequences, and your module is now part of our global rollout." Derek stirred his coffee. "Just glad it's helping." "It is," she said. "We've already had 2 incidents where crews used your framework to de-escalate before it blew up. No police, no trauma, just professionalism." He nodded. That was the goal. Not punishment, but prevention. That evening, he boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. for a bureau conference. This time, he wore his uniform. Dark slacks, pressed shirt, FBI windbreaker with the seal on the chest. No hiding, no blending in. At the gate, the TSA agent checked his ID, then did a double take. "Wait, you're that agent, aren't you? The one from the flight?" Derek gave a small smile. "Guilty." The agent shook his hand. "My sister's a flight attendant. She used your training last month, said it gave her the words she needed when a passenger started making comments about another traveler's religion. You helped her do her job better." Derek didn't know what to say. Just glad it worked. On the plane, the lead flight attendant recognized him right away. "Agent Langston," she said, voice warm but professional. "Welcome aboard. We've got you in 3A. Extra legroom on the airline." He chuckled. "You didn't have to. We wanted to," she said. "Not because of the badge, because of what you stood for." As he settled in, he noticed something different. No one stared. No one clutched their bags. A little girl across the aisle pointed and whispered to her dad, "Is that a real FBI guy?" Her father smiled. "Looks like it. Be respectful." During the flight, a passenger dropped a magazine near his seat. When Derek handed it back, the man said, "Thanks, sir," with a nod that carried genuine respect. Not fear, not curiosity, just simple human acknowledgement. It wasn't perfection. The world hadn't been fixed overnight. But in this small metal tube flying through the sky, things felt calmer, kinder. Back home a week later, a plain envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address. Inside, a handwritten note on simple paper. "I don't expect you to read this, but I needed to write it. I was wrong. Deeply, shamefully wrong. I let fear override my humanity, and in doing so, I stripped yours away, even if just for a moment. The course helped. But what really changed me was seeing your face in that video. Calm, dignified, refusing to become what I assumed you were. I'm working with a local group now to help others recognize their own blind spots. It's slow. It's hard. But it's necessary. Thank you for not giving up on people like me, a woman still learning." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that people can change even when it's messy and late. A few days after that, he got a call from an international aviation safety group. They wanted to adapt his training for crews in Europe and Asia. Would he consult on cultural nuances? He said yes because the work wasn't about one flight. It was about making sure the next person, anywhere, anytime, didn't have to endure what he did. One quiet Sunday morning, Derek sat on his apartment balcony with a fresh cup of coffee. The city hummed below, cars, distant laughter, the clink of a neighbor's wind chime. He thought about all the times he'd boarded a plane bracing for suspicion, for sideways glances, for the weight of being seen as a threat just for existing. But now, when he flew, he didn't carry that armor the same way. Not because the world had become perfect, but because he'd helped build a small shield, not just for himself, but for others. His phone buzzed. A text from his niece. My teacher said my everyday hero project made her cry. She wants to use it in next year's class. You're officially educational material now. He laughed out loud. Later that day, he walked through the park near his building. Kids played soccer. An elderly couple shared a bench. A street musician played a soft jazz tune on a saxophone. He stopped to listen. The music floated through the air, warm, steady, full of feeling. And for the first time in a long time, Derek didn't feel like he had to prove he belonged. He just did. Not because of a badge, but because he'd shown up, again and again, with patience, with dignity, with hope. And sometimes that's enough to change the air we all breathe.